Edge, Professor of Mental Health and Inclusivity at the University of Manchester, to tell us about some of the work that she's been doing and the implications that has for ethnic inequalities in mental health care.
Thank you very much, Aveek. And thanks everybody for being here. So it's a great pleasure to share a little bit about my work with you. But let me caveat it by put it in the context. We're talking about ethnic inequalities, ethnic disparities in mental health. But inequalities occur for all ethnic groups in terms of access, experience, and outcomes. And indeed, they also intersect so that we have people with different characteristics. And what that tends to do is to amplify those inequalities. So in terms of age and gender, socioeconomic status, and so on. And these inequalities also occur across the lifespan. So many of you will be familiar with Sir Michael Marmot's work around the social determinants of health and ill health. So just to give you a couple of examples before I move on to my stuff. If you're a child diagnosed with autism, you're 60% more likely to come from a disadvantaged background. And you're 36% more likely, to not have English as your first language. And if you're Black and multiracial, they account for about 5% of child and adolescent mental health services, so CAMS, but 36% of those who are detained in the highest level of seclusion, of security. And at the other end, older people. So if you're a Black older person, you have about 22% higher incidence of dementia compared to a white British person. But for South Asians, it's about 17% lower. And that's just a point of saying, the tendency to agglomerate all people from minority backgrounds under the BAME, we tend not to do the BAME anymore, do we? But the BAME umbrella, or to not look for differences even between those groups, is quite problematic. And that's partly accounts for why some of our services are so undifferentiated. But I'm going to focus on the area that I'm working on in particular at the moment, which is one of the most long-standing and well-reported disparity in mental health, and that's in schizophrenia, psychosis scare. So if you're a Black Caribbean or Black African origin person, including those who are Black British and mixed or multiple heritage, your risk of being diagnosed with schizophrenia, narrowly defined, is about 7 times greater than if you're a white British person. And alongside that, much more negative pathways into care. So much less likely to be referred by your GP, much more likely to be sectioned under the mental health act, 4 times as likely, in fact. And once you're in care, it doesn't get much better, frankly. So much higher levels of control and restraint, much more likely to be held in seclusion, higher rates of being injected with antipsychotics. And I'm sure you'll be familiar with some of the stats about deaths in services, whether that's with involvement of the police or not, amongst Black people, psychiatric care. And much less likely to have access to psychological therapies, which is where my work comes in. So what we're doing with a group of people across the UK, we are currently trialling a new intervention that we've taken a standard evidence-based model of family intervention, because family intervention is something that NICE recommend for the treatment of psychosis. And we've worked with people with lived experience as service users, as carers, as health professionals. And we've done some work to culturally adapt it to make it more relevant, more appropriate, more accessible for people from Black, African, and Caribbean backgrounds. And you might ask, well, why would you even need something to be culturally adapted? We've got an NHS that's the staff that work in it are multicultural, people who are trained. But the reality is that NICE themselves talk about the workforce as being culturally naive, and also people that just don't understand how to work cross-culturally. So one of the novel aspects, I'm just going to mention briefly about one of the reasons why we needed to culturally adapt, is that we've brought in an element where we are working with what are called family support members. So NICE recommend family intervention, in quotes, for people in regular contact with their families. So think about that for a moment. If you're a care leaver who've lost contact, you don't have any biological family, or you've lost your family through bereavement, or you're here from another country, then you're not likely to have access to this form of therapy. Okay, and importantly, the national, the NHS for England is currently rolling out family intervention training across the country, but it doesn't actually address working cross-culturally. So thinking about the points that have been asked about, the things about policymakers, the priorities, I think it's really important that we take a life course approach to dealing with mental health issues. We should definitely be doing some levelling up in terms of commissioning and really using the commissioning intent to transform the way services are delivered. Remembering that health and wealth are inextricably linked. We've got a huge north-south divide, not just between the north of the country and the south, but even within conurbations. We need more solution-focused approaches that take a very assets-based approach to people with lived experience. So working with the people who use our services to help to co-create the kind of services that will work really well. And also the people who deliver the services. So that's what we've done with the cafe model. We've worked with health professionals and people who use services. And finally, I think we are in the technological age. I think there is a real space for digital health, but we have to be really careful that in using digital health and harnessing the potential, we don't leave anyone behind.
Brilliant. Thanks for being so succinct. I'm sure you could have gone on for most of the session. We'd let you, and we will certainly come back to that. So next, I'd like to bring in Councillor Emma Best, who's an Assembly member and the health spokesperson for the Conservatives.
Thank you. And it's hard to follow a professor who has so much data, but I guess I'll tell you a little bit about me and my background to understand perhaps where my interest drives in this. So before I entered politics, I worked on the front line of children's services, and I was a big part in early intervention and family hubs. For me, health inequalities are the fundamental foundation of trying to fix the other inequalities in life. If you aren't healthy physically, if you aren't healthy mentally, how on earth are you going to be able to get on and do anything else and provide for your family, achieve the goals and achieve your ambitions? And I think actually the health inequalities within our society are really a flag of the systemic consequence of underfunding prevention. And instead being responsive to what falls out from health concerns. Health inequalities is what happens before and what we should be preventing. I wanted to talk specifically about some of the work that we've been doing on the London Assembly, where I'm the health lead for the Conservative group there, and also served as the deputy chair of that group, and particularly focus on maternal health care. So I'm not sure, perhaps people may be familiar with the group 5 Times More, and they were established by two women back in 2019 to advocate for Black pregnant women during their birth, because you are in the UK 4 times more likely to die if you are a Black woman giving birth. And the other thing that came out as well in the NHS long-term plan is that you are significantly more likely to have your infant die in the womb as well. And at 5 times more, they've brought this down to the disproportionate lack of understanding around health conditions and approach to Black women within the healthcare system. Now, that of course in itself has a consequence on mental health as well. And I think actually what was really interesting from that discussion was one of the main topics that they brought up was a lack of recognising Black women's pain and suffering during birth, and a lack of intervention that they receive as a consequence of that. And of course, what flagged to me then is that is clearly not just something that occurs in childbirth or in pregnancy. That clearly is a problem that exists within our NHS. So when we're talking about mental health conditions which don't present themselves in the form of your limb falling off, or your leg falling off, that's going to be harder to spot. And if there is already a foundation there that those problems and that pain isn't going to be recognised, then clearly there's going to be disparity in the healthcare you receive. I think this was really interesting. We were looking recently at eating disorders, and those from minority ethnic backgrounds are rarely diagnosed with eating disorders. And to me, I thought that's a flag. I mean, it seems like, you know, the pressures of society, the pressures of why you may fall into having an eating disorder. I don't think that would be exclusive to a white British population. Though to me, it seems concerning that it only seems to be white British people that are, for the majority, being diagnosed with those conditions and receiving that support. So I think in what we have in London is we've looked at more culturally competent healthcare, and we actually see how this works. And if you look particularly at the vaccine rollout, and you'll know that obviously the vaccine rollout highlighted that mistrust that many from minority ethnic backgrounds feel when they approach healthcare systems. And what was undertaken in London to address that was things like going into the community, using ambassadors, and trying to approach vaccines in a much more culturally competent way. And that saw success within London. So that's clearly the model that works, and that's clearly the model that needs to be applied more widely. So I think I'd be interested to hear questions before, and I will try and wrap up. But just to say, that is some of the work that we've been doing within the assembly on this. There's also the NHS long-term plan, which, as I said earlier, identifies this issue, and we have by March 2024 the goal of rolling out to 75% of the community-based care. So we are on the right path, but we need to make sure that both government, regional government and local government do this and pick up the baton. And actually, we've identified the problem that's been long ignored. Now it's time to fix it.
Fantastic. Thanks, Emma. Now I'm going to throw over to Samuel Kasumu, who is a social entrepreneur, a sort of commentator, and former advisor to the Prime Minister.
To the former Prime Minister. This one doesn't listen to me. Yeah, thank you. I'm really grateful for being given the opportunity to be on the panel. As was mentioned, I worked at Down the Street. One of the things I was responsible for, so I completely agree with Emma, was the vaccine rollout. And one of the things we did was we set up a £25 million community engagement fund where we could empower communities to deal with some of the structural challenges that led to some of the disproportionality around vaccine. I was also responsible for getting the mental health white paper published. So by that time, it landed on my desk. Most of the heavy lifting had happened, and folks like Dr. Lade is very intimidating for me because he usually challenges me in private. Hopefully he doesn't challenge too much in public. Oh, she also features in my new book. There's a chapter here. whoever has the best question will get a copy. But yeah, that was my job. So I had to look at the mental health white paper with fresh eyes. And my main critique at the time was, and probably my main critique of the mental health is also that there was so much emphasis on, in fact, there wasn't enough emphasis on what happens upstream. So, you know, pretty much all of the focus, in my view, at the time was on what happens when it's too late. You know, once the breakdown has happened, once engagement with provision is inevitable, and once the engagement is not a positive one. So I wanted to know what could be done to reduce the likelihood of people from minority ethnic backgrounds like me having to engage with mental health services at all, or certainly reduce the opportunity for them to engage with it at an extreme level. So I have to say, it is still my most significant interest because there are factors that are known to increase the likelihood of experiencing psychosis, as we've heard previously. But the education in this area, for me, is still lacking. And yes, we've had some micromarkets, social determinants of health, so we should all really be aware, and there are limited excuses for us not better educating the public. So the idea of culturally adapted family intervention sounds very interesting to me because I think engagement with families at risk early on, educating them on both what is available and how to find your voice to avoid or flag adverse experiences is critical. As we know, African Caribbean people in the UK experience the highest incidence of schizophrenia and the greatest inequity in mental health care. Racism and racial bias obviously is a factor, But I do not think we will ever have a world where racism and bias does not exist. And that might sound like a depressing thing to say, but as we have psychiatrists in the room, surely we can be honest about how the human mind is wired. So for me, the solution to improving mental health provision does require, of course, high standards, training, and to constantly remind practitioners of how they're supposed to conduct themselves. But even with all of this, there will still unfortunately be examples where things don't go to plan and where bias could be a contributing factor. So for me, the priority has to be to give families and communities the confidence and knowledge to know what good provision looks like. To empower them to view themselves as people that should expect the highest standards, giving communities access to advocates that will fight on their behalf, that will also deal with barriers to improving outcomes, particularly when there are language barriers and other contributing factors. Now, obviously, it is very unlikely, so to say, that there will be a Conservative administration after the next general election. I'm allowed to say it because I'm a Conservative. But with the Labour Party no longer having a shadow Secretary of State for mental health, we know that there will still be a need to push for the dial to be shifted. Research will of course have a very significant role to play, but speaking the language of policy requires a focus, dare I say it, on numbers in every sense. Frankly, and I'll say this to someone that used to working down the street, the emotional argument or the emotive argument doesn't really wash when leaders are out of touch or too busy to spend much time on a subject. So in conclusion, I think good outcomes comes from people knowing what good looks like. There is no one solution. The uncomfortable truth is there are times when the reasons for poor provision will never fully be known. So there must be more focus on empowering communities to be able to have their voice, to be able to advocate on behalf of their loved ones, and to know what a high standard provision looks like.
Thanks, Samuel. And to challenge that, hopefully, I'd like to bring in Dr. Lade Smith, CBE, who is president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists.
So, first of all, thanks for inviting me. I have to say that what people often don't realise is that we actually do know what causes mental illness. Genetics are important, but it's not enough to have a genetic predisposition. Perinatal factors are important, so well done, Emma, for mentioning about maternal morbidity. We know that if you're exposed to toxins in the womb, like lead, or you're small for dates, or you're exposed to flu viruses, for example, that significantly increases your risk of developing a severe mental illness 20 years later. We know that trauma is important, especially early life trauma, and adverse life events as an adult, moving house being one of the worst, for example, bereavement. And we know, of course, that substance use is important. And these are factors that are really important to clinicians, such as myself. And what happens is that we don't go trolling the streets looking for people who are unwell. We wait, and this is where Samuel is correct. We wait until people are unwell, and then when they're really unwell, we see them and we sort out the damage that has been done. And Samuel's right, actually, it's too late. It's far too long. It's far too late down the pathway for people. Because then what happens is, frankly, what we do is secondary prevention. People are unwell, and then we get them better, and we try and stop them from becoming repeatedly unwell again and again and again. They have relapsing remitting conditions. Already by the time they meet us, and I have to tell you now, unfortunately, mental health problems are illnesses of young people. Unlike most health problems, physical health problems start when people are in their mid to late age, middle age and onwards. And by that time, you've already fulfilled your potential. You've already become someone who's reached their peak productivity and you've been able to have a relationship and so on and so forth. You've been able to have a job, you've been able to pay into the tax coffers. But unfortunately, 75% of mental health problems happen in children and young people. We can treat them, actually. People don't realise we can treat mental health problems, and we've been doing so really, really well. In fact, we've been treating more people than ever before, despite the fact we have fewer staff than ever before. The thing is this, that what we haven't done quite so well is acknowledge the other risk factors for mental illness, social determinants of health. Social determinants of health are really important, and frankly, the evidence now is clear that, as Michael Marmot said, and as Dawn has pointed out, social determinants are important, but also so is discrimination. And there's increasing evidence that these factors are additional risk factors for developing mental illness. And why is that important? We know it's important because if you are from a minoritized ethnic community in the UK, then you may have an increased risk of adverse childhood experiences. And adverse childhood experiences are things like, being brought up in a household where there just isn't enough money. We know that if you are that being rich does not prevent you from having a mental health problem, but it helps because you know that people who are in the bottom deciles of wealth in our population have more than 2 times the rate of mental health problems. That's more than 2 times the rate of mental health problems. We are in the Northwest. The Northwest is much poorer than the South, and the rates of mental health problems are more than twice what they are in the South. And it's quite an incredible thing. And Dawn says, as Dawn says, there is a difference as well between areas. So if you are born in South Kensington, which is a really rich area, then your life expectancy is almost 10 years higher than someone born in North Kensington, which is actually a really quite deprived area. These things are important, particularly when it comes to mental health and developing mental illness later in life. Why is that important to minoritized ethnic communities? Because what we know is that certain minoritized ethnic communities grow up in more deprived areas, are actually more at risk of some of the negative social determinants of health, and we know are more exposed to adverse childhood experiences. And we know that that's the case for people particularly from Black Caribbean backgrounds, some Black African backgrounds. We know, interestingly, if you look at South Asian people, then there are people who are from Indian backgrounds are very different from people from Bangladeshi backgrounds and Pakistani backgrounds. They have very different health outcomes. And why is that? Well, in the 1980s, people from Indian backgrounds, 1 in 20 Indian men was a doctor. And so the immigration of Indian people into the UK was very different to Bangladeshi people. In the 1980s, people coming from Bangladesh were often escaping war, famine, and flood. And actually, we're coming with very little, actually. And if you look at maps across the country, those people who are wealthier, who are living in deprived backgrounds, are actually much more likely to be Bangladeshi and Pakistani, whereas people who are South Asian from Indian background are much more likely to be living in actually wealthier areas and actually have the same level of wealth income as people from white British backgrounds. That's important because it does have an impact on people's health outcomes. And so the point about for us is this, and I have to say that there's a big emphasis about a focus on psychosis, particularly when it comes to Black people. I think the problem there is this. Actually, the issue is that all the factors that increase the risk of people developing mental health problems are concentrated in certain ethnic minority communities, particularly Black people and Bangladeshi and Pakistani people. And so it's inevitable that you would see a higher rate of mental health problems in those groups. And it's particularly important because we've been ignoring this and we haven't been disaggregating the data. We have been lumping everyone together. And that then masks, so for example, for Bangladeshi people, it masks the poor health outcomes that they have because the people who are Indian are doing okay. And for Black people, what you see is that for Black Caribbean people, there is actually a masking of some of the ongoing social difficulties that they have because it's being masked by some of the improvements seen in particularly later generations in Black West African populations. What we're doing at the college, I'm going to finish in a minute, I'm sure, but sorry, what we're doing at the Royal College of Psychiatry is this, having recognised this, it's now in our curricula that all trainee psychiatrists have to be able to understand about social determinants of health, particularly mental health. We are expecting all psychiatrists to understand that they are going to have to be able to think about people in a whole kind of holistic way. So that's thinking about we basically take a biopsychosocial approach, not just their psychological functioning, but the environment in which they are brought up in and which they're going to go back to when we've treated people. And we are increasingly expecting that psychiatrists are getting involved in developing policy, because what we do is patch people up and then send them right back to the conditions that made them ill in the first place. and that's not helpful. It's not so rewarding as when people get properly well. And just finally, the other thing that we're doing is trying to ensure that psychiatrists really understand about discrimination, understand about their own unconscious bias. Unconscious bias training is not going to change things, but what you can do is think about some of the structures that we have in place in terms of the care that we deliver. Emma mentioned something about inaction in the face of need. Essentially, when you see that there's a problem, but you don't actually have a service to help those people with that problem. So, for example, we in mental health care, we have lots of patients who have psychosis. Frankly, substance use drives psychosis. Lots of papers showing that. There's a very big paper that's come out of the Journal of American Medical Association showing that substance use is associated with development of severe mental illness. And unfortunately, what we don't do is have services that support people with their substance use. And so surprisingly, especially people from ethnic minority groups. And it's no great surprise then that actually people have continuing relapsing remitting conditions because we don't do anything about it. So mainly the main thing to say is this: we now know this is a problem. We are working on it. We are training psychiatrists so that psychiatrists understand that we need to be trying to focus on things at a much earlier stage. This is about early prevention and early intervention.
Fantastic, thanks, Lade. And to round off our opening contributions, I'd like to bring in Dean Russell, MP, who is chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Mental Health.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me here today. It's fantastic to hear the panellists. Thankfully, they've covered all the points I was going to make, so my 40-minute speech now hopefully took during. But in all seriousness, I'm the MP for Watford. We're a very multicultural community. We have an incredibly strong interfaith community, and I'll touch on that in a few moments why I talk about that. One of the areas that I've been very passionate about is around mental health for many, many years. I see Danny at the back there, who's done work many years ago with us together. He's a fantastic advocate. I definitely recommend you getting to know him. And I think there's so much work that's gone on, but over the past 10 to 15 years, there's been a shift in the way that we talk about mental health, and I think that's a good thing. The past 3-4 years, I think the risks around stigma seem to have slowly eroding, but they're still there. There absolutely is still stigma around mental health and mental well-being. One of my areas was talking about mental health within the workplace. So I've been trying to change the law so that there's mental health first aid mechanisms around mental health and mental well-being. And I've been pushing to try and change the health and safety executive guidelines so that when you mental well-being. And I've been pushing to try and change the health and safety executive guidelines so that when you talk about things like first aid, for example, that you have to do a health and safety check and audit for every business to say what the potential. Talk about things like first aid, for example, that you have to do a health and safety check and audit for every business to say what the potential risks. And I say that if you can create absolute parity between physical and mental health, then the risks can then be identified around mental health as well. And I was very pleased in the recent suicide strategy document that both of those areas have been looked at and are being adopted in broad terms, as I'm still going to be a pain in the backside to the government to make sure that they go full on. But the reason why I say that is that I think there's a lot of really good things that have come out in the past few years around mental health. But one of the areas that is still a challenge absolutely is about inequalities, but it's also about understanding the society we live in. One of the parts that I've been working on with a charity, amongst others in Watford, called One Vision, is looking at how faith has a role in this to play as well. I hosted an event just recently in Parliament where we had faith leaders from many, we've had so many faith leaders that were literally almost falling off the edge of the stage in the committee room because we had so many different groups represented, and there still weren't anywhere near as many as we would have liked. But I think there's a role here within society, and especially within faith, of trying to break down the stigma that occurs around mental health and mental well-being. Within some communities, and in fact probably most communities, but within some communities, the idea of talking about mental well-being and mental health, and mental illness especially, comes with an additional stigma around faith. Actually, perhaps one should be praying about these issues, and actually perhaps one would go to their faith leaders to try and get support, but not necessarily get the support that's needed from the the practitioners and the medical teams that might be able to help on this. I think there's another really important point here, though, which I think is what I call about the single patient view. I've talked about this when I was on the Health and Social Care Select Committee around broader health issues, as well as physical and mental health. If we start looking at patients not as sort of a group of symptoms, but actually as individuals, you start to then untangle a lot of these issues because you're looking at a person. And I think increasingly what's happened with the NHS over many, many years, and it's not really a criticism of it, it's quite a fragmented group. You break your arm, you go and get your arm looked at, and you might get an x-ray, and you might get a cast, and then you might get looked at 6 months later. There wouldn't be any conversation probably about the fact that you might not be able to work and go to or drive. There wouldn't be any conversation about the impact that might have on you and your family. There might not be any conversation within that around how that's going to affect your mental health and mental well-being. If you have a long-term condition, how does that all wrap together? And I think that's one of the challenges here, is about understanding how we look at individuals and look at how physical and mental health interact. How do we make sure that we've got those parts connected within government, within local government, around the NHS, around public health, around social care? And I feel that digital has an important role here. I won't talk about that too much, but I think there's a role here of making sure that we start to look forward at innovations that look at the individual, that look at the patient not as a group of symptoms, but as someone who's got a life, who perhaps has a family, who's got to go to work. How do we support them in the short term? How do we make sure that the treatments are there, not just to fix what's broken in their arm in that instance, but actually to help them get through it, perhaps to adapt in their life? And that's why I often talk about mental health in the workplace, because we spend so much time there. If we can make workplaces better for mental well-being, I think that's got to be good for everyone. And then very finally, I think there's an important role of these sorts of discussions and these sorts of panels. I've said this in Parliament before, or at least whether I've said it explicitly, but effectively that, if an MP can go up and talk about mental health, there's no excuse why a CEO can't. There's no excuse why a manager in a business can't. There's no excuse why another leader in another part of our society can't. And I think the more you break down that stigma at the top, it also helps them break down the stigma through all parts of society. Because the biggest challenge, I would say, and I might be challenged on this myself, but the biggest challenge is that people don't get the support or help until they absolutely need it. And then it becomes harder to treat. If we can deal with the challenges around mental well-being, and that includes the built environment, making sure there's green space, all of those things, then in my view, then it starts, and opening up those conversations, in my view, that will help with all of these issues. But we've got to look at people and not symptoms.
Great, thanks so much. I'll kick the discussion off with a question. So a theme that kind of came across, basically across everyone's contributions, was the idea of prevention. We've got to move upstream. It's too late. It's not too late, but it is. We want to. We can do much better. We want to prevent people getting into a situation where they need kind of acute care. And there was lots of ideas thrown out there. I mean, if you take prevention, it can feel it's hard to get your arms around. It is, well, we'll just abolish poverty then to be glad, or and from that down to the very specific things of, well, let's talk about lead, or let's talk about substance use. Where should we start kind of thinking about prevention? What should be the priority if the objective is to kind of stop the flow upstream? I know it's all of it, but where do we start?
So people may or may not know, but last week there was a report that was published called Mentally Healthier Nations. It was primarily written by the Centre for Mental Health, but it was supported by about 30 different health organisations, mental health organisations, charities, and also we at the Royal College of Psychiatrists very much supported it as well. And actually that has a blueprint for what you can do, and it very much focuses on prevention and early intervention. It's really very clear that there really needs to be a mental health strategy for children and young people. And that should be a cross-party thing, actually, because there's no point pretending that this is something that's going to happen very quickly. This is something that's going to take a generation to see the improvement on. And therefore, it needs a cross-party agreement. And if you were to follow the template of that document, it does include things like, for example, adding £20 to universal credit. That would make a difference. I know that might not be something people want to hear said in a conference like this, but actually it does make a difference, because those adults can then make sure they've got good nutritious food on the table for their kids, and actually good nutritious food makes a difference not only to your mental health but your physical health too. It includes ensuring that it's parenting input. Actually, too many. We have got as on the 13th of October, the Royal College of Psychiatrists has a report coming out about early years. So it literally is that first 1,000 years of a child's life are crucial. I work in my clinical work. I'm a forensic psychiatrist, and I meet people who are, for the most part, young men. And by the time I've met them, it really is too late. They've developed a severe mental health problem that unfortunately has resulted in them coming into contact with the criminal justice system. They're 20 years of age. I look at them and I think, do you know what? If I'd met you when you were 3, then all this could have been sorted out. And that's because by the time they were 3, it was really obvious that their parenting was poor, that they were a child who was living in a household with violence, for example. They were living in an area that was surrounded by drugs, but so by the time they were 11, they were going to be offered cannabis, amphetamines, etc., all of which unfortunately have very negative effects on the growing brain. And it was inevitable they were going to become my patients. And I actually do a talk to people how to stop your child from becoming a forensic patient, because we know what the answers are, but it does require a cross-party approach with a very clear children's strategy, because these are the people who are going to be funding us later on in life. And if we don't do something about it now, then it's going to not only cost them, but it costs everybody else in society too.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so I was going to start even sooner, start during pregnancy.
Yeah.
Because we know that poor maternal health actually has a knock-on effect on child mental health and physical health as well. And I think it is about taking a much more, we talk about holistic care a lot, but actually in practice we're very siloed in the way we do things. And maybe one of the things we need to really go back to basics. And whereas we now have an NHS, although it's called the National Health Service, is very focused on illness. We need to really go back and think about some of the things we've mentioned already about what is health, what does good health look like, and what are the things that contribute to that, and start to put in the work sooner. We have decimated services like health visiting, people who would be working with families earlier on, very, very soon with them to identify problems. And because we don't have that kind of mindset about seeing mental health as a public health issue and doing a lot of preventative work, it is inevitable that we're going to pick up stuff later on. So as Lade says, most teachers, I've got members of my family were teachers, and they can spot the child in the classroom. They can spot them at nursery school. We're having children, 3-year-olds being excluded from school, from nursery, because they're violent. We're having 4-, 5-, and 6-year-olds on medication. Well, we've lost the plot, haven't we? Because really, some of that is not to do with one of my colleagues is a clinical psychologist who works within a cancer service. And he says so many of the people who are being referred, these young children and young people being referred for medication, what they need is parenting. What they need is good quality parenting. And that's not to blame the parents, because some of those parents weren't parented themselves very well. So but putting in that investment in running parenting classes, you could make a huge difference. So it doesn't have to be a lot of money. It's a different way of thinking about things, a different mindset, and having things that properly join the family.
Thanks, Tom.
It's just a quick point on the first 1,000 days, actually. So the one of bits of work I've had a very small role in, and a very small, very small role is with Andrea Leadsom on her digital red book work. And for me, I'm really passionate about it because she's done incredible work on this, but a lot of her activities have been around early years, but it's been about that first few months of a child's life. And I think one of the roles for me talking about this sort of idea of a single patient view is how do you make sure that everything's connected and you see the person holistically. And the digital red book work, if you've if any of you get a chance to look into it, is very much about that. It's about how do you make sure that you've got a digital record for babies and children. Because at the moment, when one has a baby, or when a woman has a baby, she's given the parents are given a red book and they'll write down stuff in it. And it's all very analog. It's very old school, as it were. It's paper. And actually, the idea of being able to put those records and that digitally into the system that marks the first few months of that baby's life, which will shape the entirety of that child's life, that person's life. Those first few months, those first few years, the first few days and hours are essential to get right. And I think that really ties into this idea of making sure that we get it right from the start. And the opportunity right now is to do that for every generation going forward. And I think it's something I'm really passionate about. And Andrea's done just phenomenal work on this.
Samuel?
Yeah, no, all really interesting points. And yes, Andrea, but also Dean has been doing some excellent work in Parliament on this subject. So I suppose just a few things. The reality is, and I always try to be like open, honest, and direct about things. There is not a lot of money that's going to be flying around in the short to medium term. I know Lade mentioned an increase in universal credit. I mean, the reality is, the chancellor's made some noises around his direction of travel. It's very unlikely that you will find that there is a Labour, not administration, but team who decide to promise to increase universal credit anywhere near between now and a general election. So you're probably going to be looking at, because of inflation, a real time to cut in benefits. And I hate to say it, but that is probably going to be the case at best. And so the challenge we have is, how do you improve outcomes, knowing that the investment that would make life easier is probably not going to come. And I think the first thing is you have to focus on how you can remove the stigma by better educating people around the risk factors. And what I mean by that is, if you know that you are not experiencing what you're experiencing because you're a bad person or because you're unlucky, but actually there were factors that could have been identified a lot sooner, then maybe perhaps people who can support you are more likely to give you that intervention. You mentioned faith groups. I think faith communities have a role to play, both in being better educated themselves, using that education to empower their congregations, but also being the part of the advocates that you need to make sure you have better outcomes when you engage with that provision. So civil society is going to have to play a significant role. And again, it's very depressing to say, look, there's no money. Civil society needs to play a role. But the reality is, we have to be very honest about the cards that we've been dealt as a country for various reasons, which we're not going to debate or discuss here. And so I think better education, better advocacy, and better involvement with civil society is probably going to be the most immediate ways that we can start trying to shift the dial. And the hope is that in the months and years to come, some of the required investment as well will also appear. But these are tough times economically, and so we have to be very creative about getting the change that we wish to see.
Great. So we've got a few minutes for a few questions. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, and I will really be trying brief, because I know people want to come in, but it's kind of what I did my work on. So I wanted to really try and be brief, but say we actually worked with piloting ACE surveys with pregnant women, like I say, trying to start as soon as you can to identify those people that may be in need of support. And there's a balance, and we learned this, because you have to, as well as saying we need action and we need to prevent, which is something I strongly believe in, we need the right action. And sometimes you don't want to trigger people, you don't want to tell them, you've suffered 5 ACEs, you're probably going to run into troubles. That's quite alarming to some people. So there is a balance to be played, and I'm not sure how to do that. But so the surveys wasn't a great idea. But one thing we did do, and it was amazing, was the virtual reality sets with some of our young pregnant mothers, and showing them what the baby sees in the womb. And you literally see, you put this set on and you are the baby in the womb, and you experience what the baby is experiencing in terms of environment and sound. And that was really, really helpful in trying to explain to people that your baby's life begins right now, and that parenting journey is starting right now. And the next step from that is family hubs, and not losing people in family hubs. If anybody's had a child, or they'll probably know that you start with this really intense medical support, and people seeming like you're there in day one in a hospital or at home birth, if that's how you chose to do it. then you'll get, a visit 24 hours, and then it drops and it drops and it drops until you are feeling extremely alone in what is a massive change in your life. And the questions are all about the baby. The questions are how a baby, but the question, and you often have people who are fighting for survival who don't want to show that anything is wrong. And the questions are never about how are you, and it is okay to not be okay right now. And if we could identify at those points those people that are struggling, that would be really helpful. I think there has been a case sometimes of throwing the baby out the bathwater in terms of stopping what was bad preventative work that was I will frankly say wasting money. But good preventative intervention puts pounds into the treasury, and so we should always remember that. I think also, just to take things, it said the digital passport stuff, but that stuff is so important. When people tell the same story again and again and again, that is where they lose trust in the system. That's where they lose trust with the professionals that are there to help them. So if we can let people tell their story once and help them from there, that is going to be one of the best things we can do to support mental health in this country. And the other final thing I'll say is it's about the whole life of NHS. So you have this really intense period of support in the first 5 years, and then when you're an older person, you have this really intense support. And you have this whole entire middle section where we're just hoping that everything's okay if you don't bother us. And actually, that's really integral to understanding somebody's journey. That's really integral to supporting mental health. And we have to understand a person's life journey and support them health-wise throughout. And I'll just reiterate again, if we do that, we put pounds into the treasury, we don't take it out.
Thank you. It's time for a couple of questions. The gentleman back there.
Yes, hi. Danny Bowman from the University of Liverpool. I just wanted to ask a question around mental health hubs. We're talking about prevention and money going into the treasury. Isn't mental health hubs a nationwide distribution of mental health hubs the right way forward to reduce the enormous cost of mental health in this country?
Great. Any other questions? I'll take a couple. Yes, back there.
Yeah, so I'm Steve Willigan from BACP. Just to say a brief, fascinating panel, great ideas. I just wanted to talk and return to some of the points that Samuel made about, I suppose, political expediency is being a big challenge. And I know Lade mentioned the need to work cross-party. I think we need a really good grown-up revitalisation of politics in this country. And we're currently the only part of the UK that doesn't offer counselling in schools. We routinely get access to counselling, even in Northern Ireland, which is the poorest part of the UK, which have done for 17 years. Every other part of the UK invests in counselling for kids. We don't do it in England. I think that's a minimum we should be thinking about. But the money does need to be found. I think parking people on a lifetime of either benefits, criminal justice, or very expensive pharmaceuticals isn't a great answer either. So I do think we need that revitalisation.
Great, thanks. I think we've just got 5 minutes left, so I'll let you respond to that and yeah, probably wrap up. So, Sammy, do you want to go first? Or?
The only thing I would say is I completely agree with that. In fact, I sounded quite, depressing 5 minutes ago, but family hubs is the one area where there has been quite significant investment, and that was because of the hard work of a lot of parliamentarians and community groups. It's a very effective way of trying to deal with a lot of the challenges upstream. And so there's a good news story around family hubs, and perhaps we all need to engage with all the good that could come from it more. Over to you.
Oh, thank you. On hubs, absolutely, mental health hubs. I'm a big fan of those. I've seen the work that's been done with, the principle of them in essence is so valuable. I think in terms of growing up politics, I've actually in the chamber, you can check this on the record. I've talked in debates where I've talked about, we need to be less political on this stuff. We need to be not even so much cross-party, just more sensible in the way that we talk about things. Because if it becomes a win or a loss, depending on who's talking, it doesn't feel right. What I would say though is that I've seen a massive shift in the past few years. In fact, when I was running for election, I had an initiative to train, a pledge to train 1,000 people in mental health first aid awareness. It's a very sort of light version of mental health first aid. We just recently reached 1,000, so that was really good news in Watford. But the reason why I say is that in my maiden speech, I talked about mental health, and I look back, and that was nearly 4 years ago. the journey that I think politicians have gone on. I was probably an outlier in hindsight, talking about mental health. I was definitely an outlier by putting a very tangible thing as a pledge in my election manifesto. But the reason why I say is that I think the political narrative has shifted. I think the need, the suicide strategy that's just come out, I think it's been widely welcomed. But there is a lot of work on this. But the things, the wheels of politics are very slow. And I think on this, actually, it's moved relatively quickly, considering everything else that's been happening in the world. So I hear what you're saying, but I think I wouldn't lose hope on it. I think actually things are moving in the right direction. It just does take time, and that's it's heartbreaking at times because you want everything to be happening yesterday. But I think there's a lot of really good things we should celebrate and talk about those because. And the thing I said in Parliament was that the worry is that when politicians are talking this stuff down, when they're saying that mental health in the UK is broken, where we're not doing enough, the message that's sent out to the public is, well, I won't even try and speak to my GP about it. I won't even try and get the support because it's not going to be there. And that actually, there are instances of that, but actually there is a lot more support and more welcoming activity and conversations around this, I'd say.
So to Danny's point about mental health hubs, yes, actually we do need mental health hubs, but a very important thing to bear in mind is this. Mental well-being, as Dean said, is great, but it's not necessarily going to stop someone from developing schizophrenia. And we do need to be really, really, really careful about that. Now, I'm very much in favour of in making sure we've got as much involvement of voluntary and community services as possible, because actually people who are in those areas can really help, particularly with low-level mental health problems. But those mental health hubs aren't going to stop somebody who's got severe mental illness. And we do need to, think about the risk factors for that and trying to avoid those risk factors. That's the way to prevent it. On Steve's point, totally agree with you. We really do need, we definitely have to have a cross-party agreement. And actually, just to say to Samuel, I get what you're saying, sorry, I don't disagree, get what you're saying about there being no more money. But I would say that the problem here is that we know there's no more money in the pot. It's about what we choose to spend it on. And Emma talked about pound into the treasury. And the reality is this, that if we fail to invest in the children and young people's mental health, unfortunately, it will result in a lack of productivity later on. This is an economic argument. I know that, there are people here who maybe, actually, obviously you're all here, so you do care, but there are people here in the big conference who probably don't really care that much about children and young people's mental health unless it's their child. They should care because it's their tax coffers that's going to be paying. They should care because there's going to be a lot fewer people in the population to be able to pay their pension later on. That's why they should care. This is a productivity argument. We are losing prosperity in this country. Look at somewhere like Norway, one of the most prosperous countries in the whole world. They spend 30% of their health budget on mental health care. And why? Because they recognise that mental health is absolutely key to productivity and prosperity.
Can I just quickly respond to the point about...
Can I let you do to the final word?
Well, I think time is tight, and I would only be kind of echoing those things. I would only make clear that I think everybody at this conference does care about children and young people's mental health. I think it would be the outlier of people that don't, to be honest.
I hope so, Emma. I hope so. But we want to see, really, that's not what we're seeing on the ground.
And Dawn, do you want to sum up?
Yes, just picking up the point about the BACP, and I do think it's great to hear what the Royal College are doing in terms of their curricula, but it is, I think, astonishing that you can qualify from a whole range of different healthcare professions and have done no work around working with diversity and difference. We have curricula that's like being delivered as though it was the 1940s or 50s, and I think we need to do that work because, frankly, the work that we've been doing around cultural adaptation, what people tell us all the time is it's not the therapy that needs changing, it's the therapists. They need to know how to work with people who don't necessarily look like them or have the same background as them. And so as part of CAFE, one of the things we do is that we train all our therapists in cultural awareness, cultural humility, cultural sensitivity, and hopefully making them more confident to work across different groups.
Well, I'm sure we could have kept going for another hour if we'd had it, but unfortunately we need to give the room back and need to let you get on with the rest of your conferences. So all that's left to say is thanks so much for coming, participating in the discussion. Thanks to the panelists for their thoughts and reflections, and thanks to Policy Manchester for supporting the work, and thanks to Professor Edge in particular for the research and the initiatives. So thanks everyone.